Gotcha. Well, thank you for sharing that. Um, Thank you all for sharing your experiences. I know that talking about our childhood is maybe not something that we always get to do. Um, and in this podcast, we definitely like dive into different segments of our lives and we talk about them because it's part of the process of normalizing the fact that we all have some kind of experience, whether it is with mental health or whether it is with the shared theme of there being kind of like stigma in Black households, whether it is around mental health or whether it is around things like addiction or abuse. So like for me, hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Black Peer Perspective. Today, my colleagues Drew and Ian and I are welcoming DJ Wilkerson, who is going to be our guest speaker while we talk about stigma around mental health and trauma in Black households. Before we jump into today's conversation, we are going to allow DJ to introduce himself. So hi DJ, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about your current role and what that role looks like?
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I am a youth coordinator. What that position means is I help my organization coordinate with the youth inside of trying to elevate their voices and kind of using youth guided practice to make sure that there is a youth-centered and experience-driven voice when making decisions for the people that are participating in the program. And the program itself is a day treatment program, recovery program for people who have psychosomatic symptoms.
Gotcha. Thank you. Well, thank you again for being here. Um, just before we move on into the actual conversation, being that like most of us on this call know you and I know you and I know the work that you do, I just want to express to our audience how important the work of a youth coordinator is, because you are essentially, correct me if I'm incorrect, but you bring on current participants from the programs, right? And also like graduates from the program and get their opinions and their thoughts and like use that to further amplify the needs of the people who are in the program, right?
Yeah, and we try to also use them to, well, not use them. We also give them opportunities to be at the tables and in those boardroom meetings of where those decisions are being made ultimately. And even if it's not decisions, it doesn't just stop at decisions that are in the program. We have them prepared for other decision-making groups that handle things externally that have nothing to do with the program, but have to do with recovery and have to do with mental health. Because a lot of places have come to our program seeing our model and how we do things. They've wanted to get that same type of process going with young, experience-based voices to help guide them in the things that they're working on. So different projects outside of our program have like a lot of our participants and graduates being a part of it, trying to make sure that that voice is centered and that voice is in the room.
Very cool. Well, thank you for furthering that explanation. I just wanted to point that out because that's very similar to what peer specialists do in the way that like we are advocating for other people and we want their voices to be heard. So it's very cool that you do the work to make sure that the people who are being serviced are also like stakeholders in their own recovery and seeing the programs grow. So thank you. And now that we are done with the introduction piece, we are going to jump into today's conversation. And where today's conversation kind of stemmed from was Drew, Ian, and myself kind of talking about at some point, just like what it was like for us growing up, and hearing people talk about mental health, if we heard people talk about mental health. And it became this like idea for an episode for the podcast. And we wanted to bring somebody else on so that we can have kind of like a wider range of just what it can look like in a Black household when it comes to mental health, and when it comes to kind of like the stigma around talking about mental health or talking about trauma. But before we get into like the deeper parts of it, if everyone can just kind of share, like, what was it like for you growing up in your household? So like, who did you guys grow up with? And what was that like? And obviously this is a safe space, but you can share to the extent that you feel comfortable sharing. And can I actually kick it over to DJ since he is our guest? Normally we start with Drew, but DJ, you are our guest. So if you are comfortable answering first.
So my household, I grew up in a single parent household. I grew up with my mom. I am the middle of three kids, but I was raised as like a only child. My brother had left pretty early on. So yeah, I was in a pretty restrictive household. It was religious based, faith-based household, and that the way my mom implemented the rules and guidelines of the religion were a bit extreme. So like I didn't get to hang out with people that weren't a part of the religion outside of school, and I didn't get to have too much time to myself. So I really felt like I had a lack of control over my own life for a very long time, about up until I was like 17, and that's when I was able to. That's when she stopped trying to control the things that I was doing, for the most part, at least outside. But I also grew up like having to be one way at home and then one way at school. The way that at school that I wanted to be, that's who I was. So I led this kind of double lifestyle, and I took a lot of that for better or worse. As I got older, there were just a lot of lessons that I learned, and I'm still learning. It was pretty restrictive. My mom was pretty heavy into her religion, and I'm not going to mention the religion because like I'm not trying to give them a bad rap or anything, but like the way that my mom implemented different guidelines and the things that we were supposed to follow, the rules and everything, was very restrictive. It was suffocating. I barely had any time to myself. It was just usually a lot of time spent either like when I wasn't in school. For the most part, my free time was taken up by different religious gatherings or studying and things like that. Like I had a meeting to go to every Tuesday and Wednesday night, and then like Bible study Thursday night, and then like evangelistic preaching on Saturday mornings, and then another meeting on Sunday mornings with possibly more preaching after that. So there was just a lot of time that I wish I could have had to myself, which kind of put me in a space of like leading a double life. Like I was very much one way in school versus one way at home. And I also didn't get to like hang out with friends who weren't a part of the religion outside of school. Inside school, everything went because like she's not there, so nobody can stop me from doing anything. But yeah, it was there was just a large point in time where I just felt like I had no control over anything, and I didn't have time for anything, and I did not enjoy it until like I started kind of rebelling, and then especially when we moved to Queens, I was still going to school in Manhattan, so I was able to use that as like just that travel time. I was able to say like, the trains are like broken right now. All the trains are broken, and then I'm just staying out till like 8 p.m. and then like I'll get on the train at 9 or something. And then that's when like my phone started dying all the time, and like I didn't get calls and all this other stuff. But yeah, that was when I had more of my own freedom, and like I paid the price for it by being grounded or whatever. But yeah, there was a very tough dynamic that I had to walk, and I think it shaped a lot of how I am now, for better and worse.
Would you say your experience helped you be who you are today, or would you say it was more on the good side or more on the bad side as you look back at it today?
Very subjective to the situation, really. Like I would say that there was a lot of exposure that I got to different things that not normally a kid at that age would have gotten. Like, I was taught to do public speaking at a very early age, and this was in front of a crowd of like 100 people, right? So now I know how to do that, and that's something that like it's easier for me than it could be for some other people. I know that public speaking is like one of the greatest fears for some people, right? But that's something that comes more naturally to me. I can speak to crowds, I can speak to groups, I can speak to people one-on-one because I was kind of trained to do that. All the while I was forced in a way to do that, to be good at that. So now, while I am good at doing that, I also hate doing that. Like, I don't like talking to people. I don't like giving of myself to people when I don't feel like it. Like my social battery gets drained in 10 minutes. I don't like large parties. I don't like there's a lot of stuff where just it can be looked at as a good thing, but it can also, I've been realizing as I got older, like there's just things that I didn't vibe with, but I'm just good at it, or I'm used to it, I should say. Like there was stuff that I couldn't watch, if it was violent, if it had a gun, if there was any type of cursing, if there was magic. Like I couldn't watch like Fairly Odd Parents, and I had to sneak that. And also, I love that show. Like, so it was stuff where I got to a point where I was like just really good at being quiet.
Cool. I grew up in Queens, just like the same. But it was me, my sister, and it was me and my two sisters. But my mom always worked a lot, so she would leave the country, and my older sister would take care of me. So we never had that connection where it's like, oh, it's like brother and sister. It was more like it's my second mom in a way. So it was, and also when I started going to high school, I was dealing with like, things that regular American teenagers do when they go to high school. But my mom is like traditional African. So like some stuff that I would want to do, she would never let slide. Like sometimes I would want to go to my friend's house on a school night maybe and just hang out late, but I couldn't do that because you have to be home. So it kind of restricted me from seeing a lot of my friends out like that I made in high school. But that's yeah. So now that I'm dealing with this, right, my own diagnosis, living within an African household was kind of tricky because the way Africans view mental illness is not positive. They just dismiss you as crazy. So that's what I've been dealing with now. I mean, my mom and my sisters are really supportive of me, but like other than that, we don't really talk about it to other people. We keep it within the family. Like nobody outside of my family knows what I'm going through.
Wow, interesting. You know, I grew up with my it was about three of us growing up. It was me, my older brother, and my younger brother. My younger brother, he was out in the foster system or whatnot. My mom, she was a functional addict. Father wasn't really in the picture or whatnot. You know, different reactions from different people. You know, my brother, my older brother, he was just doing whatever he could do. You know, he's cool. He was into sports at one point as he was growing up, and then he drifted off to other things or whatever the case may be. My younger brother, I didn't really get a chance to really know him or whatnot. You know, I think one of the big things that I think we all had in common was the religious background. That was something that I guess in my generation growing up, that was something that they always tried to keep in the Black household, you know, like having some type of productivity, you know, because given all the violence, drugs, and abuse that was going on out at that time and whatnot. Spent a large variety of my time actually in the house. When I was 6 years old, between 6 and 10, I guess you can say, I was in the house most of the time. Didn't really have much hobbies, you know. I remember going to school. Not rushing to get home. All crammed up into one apartment with like 15 of us crammed up to a one-bedroom apartment. So getting away from the house was always better for me and whatnot. You know, family. Didn't really understand the idea of family at a younger age because of so much exposure that I had at such a young age to the drugs and to the abuse or whatever the case may be. You know, which actually led into me being who I am with the things that I do today, you know, which shaped me into the man that I am today, I should say.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you all for sharing your experiences. I know that talking about our childhood is maybe not something that we always get to do. And in this podcast, we definitely like dive into different segments of our lives and we talk about them because it's part of the process of normalizing the fact that we all have some kind of experience, whether it is with mental health or whether it is with the shared theme of there being kind of like stigma in Black households, whether it is around mental health or whether it is around things like addiction or abuse. So like for me, I grew up, I think, in two different segments of my life. I was raised by my grandmother and my grandfather, who are both from the Deep South. My grandmother had custody of me since I was 1 year old up until I was 12 years old. And she raised my brother, who was older than me. And then she raised me because my mother was also an addict and she was an alcoholic. And she was not very fit to take care of us. My little sister was born a few years after me. And by then, she had kind of gotten her act together to take care of my sister. So I was raised in Brooklyn with my brother and my grandmother, my grandfather, and my sister was raised in Long Island with our mom. And then when I was 12, my grandmother had a heart attack. And when she passed away, I had to stay with my mom for a little while, but that was too much of a traumatic situation for her. She couldn't handle it. And so we also ended up going into foster care not too long after that. But we were blessed in the way that the person who took us into her home was somebody that we had known since childhood because of my brother. So growing up in that household was completely different because my grandmother was very strict in terms of like, you can't watch TV, you have to be in bed at a certain time. There was no going outside. There was a lot of reading. There was a lot of like learning and just like intentional studying. Academics was very big to her to make sure that I was a smart girl, articulate. That was very important to her. And then when I moved into this house and for foster care, my sister and I, this was the first time we lived together, and we lived with my adoptive mom, who we started to just call her our aunt. So it was my aunt, her husband, and her kids. And she was very religious. And there were definitely times where she tried to like force us to go to church. And me being like a teenager by that point was very much like, no, I'm not going to church. I used to pretend like I was sick all the time. I used to pretend I was sleeping and I couldn't hear her. Eventually that started to taper off, and she stopped trying to kind of like force us into that lifestyle. And by proxy, my sister also had to deal with less of it because I was the one just like, no, we're not doing that. I was a very rebellious teenager, and that I'll talk about more in the next segment of what we're going to discuss together. But yeah, I grew up very much in like a very restrictive kind of household, and then as a teenager, I was growing up under somebody else's roof, and she, to an extent, tried to be very parental and just like, you can't do this and you can't do that. But she kind of set more expectations. Like, if you're outside, I expect you to be home by this time. If you're outside, I expect you to have your phone on. And there were definitely times I rebelled against that and I wanted to do my own thing. But I also kind of just like respected her as a person, and the fact that she took me and my sister in. So that was the two segments of my growing up. And I think it's interesting for all of us to be on here and to be talking about what it's been like to grow up in Black households, because the woman who adopted me was also a Black woman. And so like talking about this right now, I think culture and like our backgrounds play such a role in just kind of like how we were brought up and how we were raised and how things were thought about and talked about. And so there's a lot of like common veins amongst all of our stories, even though they are also very different. And that's what's good about having these conversations and normalizing, you know, like we all went through some shit at some point, and it varies, but it's okay to talk about. It's okay that we went through it, and it's okay that these are things that if we had to heal from them, we had to heal from them. And I'm going to allow that to segue us into the next question. So for you guys, when you were younger, did anyone in your family ever talk about mental health? And if they did, what kind of language did they use? Like, what were their thoughts around mental health? And DJ, if you're okay answering this one, I would like to kick this question over to you first.
So no, nobody talked about mental health. I mean, there was that was early on in the early 2000s, where mental health was only talked about in any of the communities I was a part of. It was only talked about as, you know, kind of, you see somebody kind of wilding on a train, that was mental health. That was somebody who needed help. Mental health was usually talked about in an extremist view, like as far as institutionalism or something. So, no, there was no mention of it in the household, especially because as deep as the religion ran in my household, there was no space for mental health. Everything was like, if you have a problem, you can take it up with God, and God's gonna help you, and you need to pray about it, and that's that. That's final. But also, there was no real awareness of how things were affecting me from the way that things were being ran. So there was that, like, mental health only came up in my household later on when I started, like, getting into self-harm and, like, going to more extremes. I had depression but didn't identify it, and my mom definitely didn't. She had no real background with mental health. So when it started getting to self-harm, that's when she kind of took notice and was like, okay, maybe, like, something needs to be done. Like, you're not okay. And I wasn't. And I felt like that was the only thing that got her to notice. Not saying that's why I did it, but it also felt like that was the only kind of control that I had in my life at that time. So yeah, there was that. And when we started talking about mental health, she still kind of kept it at, like, an arm's length, and I dove more into it. She allowed me to dive into it, but we never really talked about it with each other.
I don't think, unless you're working in that field or know somebody who who's gone through it, I don't, for the most part, I think people don't really take the time to look up who to, like, pay attention to mental health. So when I first got diagnosed, my family knew nothing about it because nobody in our family ever had, like, a mental break before, or even, like, studied in that field. So when I got it, we like, all we know about people with illness is, like, what we see on TV, right? Oh, that person's crazy, like, they're in the nut house wearing a straitjacket or something like that. So I guess that's what we believed, that was going to be my life. Like, I was just going to be a burden on the family now because I was diagnosed. But so yeah, that's how we first um felt about it, because I didn't know what that meant for me and they didn't know what it meant for me. Yeah.
Wow. Um, for me, with mental health growing up at a younger age, real quick to clarify, earlier, as I was explaining about my background growing up, I couldn't talk much about it because I didn't really have much of a young adult or young child grown lifestyle. Because mental health got involved in my life very early. Um, by the time I was 8 years old, I was already in the ringer of mental health. From the abuse starting at 6 years old, by 8 years old, I was already being shipped from group home to group home or whatnot. Mental health in my household was like the elephant in the room. We all knew it was there, but nobody wanted to talk about it. Oh, put them in alternative school, put them in special ed, give them medication and coffee. I say medication and coffee because that's what they used to give me. Like, the medication was so strong that they had to give me at least a shot of black coffee to balance the stuff out, or whatever the case may be. So my mom being an addict, my grandma being of age that she couldn't barely take care of me no more, me being in the hands of, I don't know, I guess family, friends at the time or whatnot, to a lot of abuse happening, to, oh, something is wrong, can you just go to the hospital? Mental health wasn't really acknowledged, long story short, in my household. We just separate him from the family, and we continue living our life while he go get the help he needs. was the play for my life. Remember coming home from group homes or psych or whatever for the weekend or whatnot, and you know, they would play like everything is normal, but it was obvious that I was the black sheep. Oh, I'm the one with the problem. You know, the half a loaf of bread, cheese buses, and all the limitations to class. Like I go to regular school half of the days, and then I go to special education for the rest of the day, or vice versa, and whatnot. Is it accepted in the household? It took a long time before it was actually accepted. You know, being muted most of my life. By the time I was the age of 16, 17 years old, I was at a semi point of acceptance that I had a mental health because I was just coming home back to family life, whatever. We was older, you know, after a couple of years, me and my brothers reunited. You know, they knew something was wrong. Hey, you know, they played me for the special brother. Not played me, but they, you know, they engaged me as a special brother. Okay, we got to be cautious with him, whatever the case may be. Not until just recently, maybe the last 2 years, the actual conversation of itself was talked about amongst the family. And I think I opened that conversation just in general to see everybody's perspectives. You know, definitely more receptive than when we was younger. And also have a desire to learn more. You know, I remember the first encounter actually with mental health, I tried to kill myself, and it was like, oh, why would you try to do that? All this other good stuff they was talking, whatever the case may be. Instead of them asking me why they think I would try to do that, I think they should have asked what was wrong at that time, but they didn't. And to this day, I still try to open that conversation. I still try to enlighten them. You know, I try to share my videos. I try to share whatever I can with them to let them know that, you know, I am who I am. I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
Okay. For me, mental health, well, I have to talk about my childhood in 2 segments. So when I was being raised with my grandmother, she was a older Black woman. So the way she talked about things and thought about things were very, very, very outdated and old school, where she would refer to people as sick, right? She would refer to people as needing to be locked up or needing to be in the crazy home or in the crazy house. Even with addiction, right, which we now we know is a mental, you know, a mental illness, but it wasn't seen as something that stemmed from mental health. It kind of was talked about as like, that person is choosing to do that thing, that person ain't shit, that person doesn't want to amount to anything more than what they are, and it was never really considered or discussed as something that was a byproduct of the person's mental health not being in good standing. And then my grandmother passed away when I was 12. So by the time I was 13, I was more adjusted into the foster care home that I was placed in. And very quickly, the narrative kind of shifts from like, you need church, you need Jesus, very similar to DJ's experience. My aunt realized same thing. Like I actually didn't start self-harming until I went to the hospital, and I got hospitalized because I told my therapist, like, when you go to ACS, you get a therapist, and I told my therapist I wanted to kill myself, and she asked me if I had a plan, and I said yes. And that was it was actually my second hospitalization, but it was my first stay in a hospital. And I picked up a lot of bad habits because I was introduced to so many different ways that other people cope with things that I came home wanting to learn how to cope the same way those kids did. And so self-harm became a very big theme in my life. And my aunt stopped looking at it through a lens of like, you know, Jesus will fix it or God will fix it. And it became a thing that we need to make sure that you're going to therapy. If you need medication, we're going to make sure that you're on the medication that you need. My door is always open. You can talk to me. So it went from like, go pray about it to I am here. I am a support system for you. I am a tangible person who is able to support you and willing to support you. And we had a lot more conversations about what it was that I needed. She wanted to talk about the way that I felt. I didn't want to talk about that. I have always been very anti talk about my feelings, even though I encourage it for people because I know that it can be useful since very early on. I think because of my abandonment issues, it was just like, I don't want to talk to you and have this relationship with you. And then one day you end up leaving and I poured so much of myself out there to you, which eventually changed over time. But yeah, it was different from growing up with my grandmother who didn't really know anything about mental health. And she was very limited in the understanding of what mental health is and how everyone has mental health, but it's a spectrum. And like some people's mental health is in better standing and some people's mental health is in worse standing, for lack of better terms. But I think it's, again, interesting to see how all of us in all of our households, how it was talked about or not talked about, or what were like the alternatives to discussing it as mental health. So I appreciate everyone for sharing that part of your lives with us, and with the viewers who are watching this. And I'm going to allow that conversation to push us into the wrap up part of the conversation, where we're now going to just talk about, in relation to how things were when you were growing up, whether you a child or teenager, now in 2021, after a pandemic, after mental health kind of gaining more traction and these being more forefront conversations as opposed to being taboo conversations, have things changed in your families? Has the way your family has talked about or thought about mental health changed? And if so, what does that look like now?
Going through it, like being a peer and also knowing what I need now and expressing that to my family, they understand a bit more about what it's like having what I'm dealing with. And I'm not just this sick person that they have to take care of all the time now. They still don't feel the need to tell other people outside of the family what I'm going through, but I think that's fine, because all I need is like the people who are the closest to me to know and understand. But other than that, I think things are getting better. You know,
I would say, in general, things is always moving forward when it comes to mental health in my household. I'm not as connected to the family as I once was, but when we do engage, they do understand, they do know, more about mental health, and they are receptive of it. They are open to it. They are open to learning and just hearing me out. It's kind of odd because I feel like they're doing the things that I needed them to do when I was younger. They're doing it now in a sense, but the relationship is not there, if that makes sense. The relationship, like when we was younger, the relationship was there. Y'all could have been doing this shit. I wouldn't be so fucked up. Now we older and here we are. And relationship ain't shit, but y'all understand. I don't know. Kind of like pushing the bird on its way, go fly, go figure it out type of thing, and come back and let us know how you did type of thing. That's how I feel it is. But overall, mental health is becoming more acceptable, not only in my family, but also in the community in general, in the world in general, I should say, is breaking different barriers or invisible walls that was there, and it's becoming more acceptive. And I'm okay with that. I'm happy with that. I'm gonna continue to do what I do.
Yeah, I mean, for me, currently, I can talk more to my dad about mental health than I can talk to my mom about it. And he has a different view about it. Honestly, I would say it's a little bit distorted because it he still thinks about mental health kind of being at this extreme in some cases. Um, like my first the first time I was hospitalized, um, I remember him coming and he like sat down and and I was in a hospital for like suicidal ideation, and I checked myself in because I was like, I don't really trust myself in this situation. And uh, he had come visited me and he sat down and he was like, tears in his eyes, like, why are you doing this, man? Like, we don't do this. And that was I was just like, what do you mean we don't do this? Like, we didn't get into that conversation. I was just like, it's hard. Like, things are hard. I need a break. And that conversation paralleled to the conversations that we have now. Like, we were driving in a car a couple of months ago, and I remember we just started talking about like what depression means to both of us. And you know, he felt like he couldn't call what he has depression because he's seen people going through so much worse, which was an interesting view to me. But at the same time, when I described what I saw as depression, he said he had everything, he experienced everything that I was talking about, and he experienced regularly, and that's just a part of his life. And I was just like, damn, dude, like, you don't even know how deep in the shit that you are. But you know, it to be able to have that conversation versus, you know, the first time we ever talked about it, it was just like, you know, that's just not who we are. That's not what we do, stuff like that. Like it's very interesting. The way that it's so much more accepted, even just for conversation, you know, if not for belief, just for conversation. But with my mom, like, there's still her faith is still what drives her, and that's what is the sole component of how you get better and do well and are well. Um, yeah, there's a different dynamic there.
Yeah, and I think for me, there are moments where I felt really alone and no one's there for me. That's why I feel like being a peer is like the biggest like F you to everybody who doubted you, because like not only are you further in your recovery, but now you're helping people to do it and you're getting paid for it. People like to not validate what you've been through and be like, you just need to get over it and get a like just move forward. But I don't know, I just feel really good about being a peer and being able to like be taken seriously by doctors and things like that, you know, or psychiatrists and clinicians, you know.
You better say that, because that's real. Like, no, that ass. For everyone who thought that I couldn't make it because I have a mental health diagnosis, look at me now, kind of thing. And I definitely appreciate that, and I agree with that 1,000%. And I think for me, very much like Ian, my family is not very connected, and it's strange the things that does connect you. Like my adoptive mom passed away last year, and she had 3 kids, and we all came together for a short amount of time, because like that's what happens when somebody dies. Like, everyone finds closeness and comfort in being together, and then you kind of just continue going about your life, and that distance kind of happens again. But in the bringing of everyone back together, mental health was very much a part of it. Like, there were conversations around depression, there were conversations around sadness, there were conversations around just mental health in general. And for me, the family that I adopted through her, they all knew that I struggled. They knew that I was, hospitalized. They knew it was, there was very much this mantra of like, what happens in this household stays in this household, but that also extends to family members, even if they don't live in this household. So like, your second aunt over is gonna know, like your cousins are gonna know. They might not know everything, but they're gonna know you was hospitalized. They're gonna know that you're struggling. And I have always been very open and vocal about mental health, even more so since becoming a peer and having experienced like the power in speaking truth and advocating for yourself. And there's not a single person that I'm not willing to have these conversations with. I am willing to correct people when people call my diagnosis an illness. And I know some people consider their diagnosis an illness, so they refer to it as mental illness, but that is not the case for me. And I recognize that that is not the case for everyone, and that can be very stigmatizing and make people feel like my view of you is that you are ill, that you are sick. And I remember how that felt for people to kind of like project that onto me. So I never want to do that to other people. And I kind of question people's understanding of what it means to have a mental health diagnosis. And when people make jokes about being bipolar or having OCD or having a personality disorder, then I'm willing to question those things, whether that is from a family member or a friend or even a participant or just somebody I'm having a conversation with that I don't know too well, because I feel like where I am in my life, it's part of what I'm here for, to further these conversations and to amplify the idea of like normalizing the fact that people have mental health diagnoses, and it does not put them in a box of they are sick, they need to be locked up, they need to be institutionalized, because that is not always the case. And some people are fine with just being like, oh, that's your thought. But for me, it's like, why do you think that? Let's talk about it, because you might be doing a disservice to the people in your life that I don't know about by saying these things and like continuing to have these views. So within my family that I do have, as distant as they are, the way that we talk about mental health, the way we think about mental health, even on Instagram or Twitter, everyone has kind of taken this approach to it as something that needs to be thought about. It's something that needs to be cared for. There's a general understanding that everyone, again, has mental health, and that it's something that we should take care of, whether we have a diagnosis or not, and that we should do our best to strive to be well. And I think that that should ultimately be the goal of everyone's family and everyone's life. I hope that one day the world gets to a point of just accepting the fact that this shit happens. Sometimes people get diagnosed with something, and that does not mean that it's the end of the world. It doesn't mean that we can't function. It doesn't mean that we can't have happy lives. And it doesn't mean that we can't have conversations and highlight the differences in between how a person with a diagnosis thinks and a person without a diagnosis thinks. And so I think that what we just did here in this conversation is a step forward towards that. And I just want to thank all of you for sharing your experiences and for sharing of yourself to me, to each other, to the people who are watching this video. And we are going to wrap it up here. But again, thank you so much. Thank you, DJ, for being here and being a part of this episode.
Thank you.
Yes, DJ.
Yeah, thanks for having me. If you don't mind, just I want to have like a final thought. I think that as far as social media is concerned and the general consciousness, I think we talk about mental health in a very basic way, like a this kind of abstract conglomerate. We aren't specific, like Drew, you had said, like talking about schizophrenia and everything. We don't. That's still a little touchy to some people and something that people don't really understand, I feel like. And just having these conversations and what y'all are doing, I think as we make it more of the conversation and the focus of the conversation, like we make that more of the norm to be able to talk about mental health as this spectrum rather than this just kind of like cloud feeling. Yeah, I really appreciate what y'all are doing, especially to have, Black faces, people of color in general, with Black faces, and it changes the game because people are going to grow up. I didn't grow up seeing Black faces talking about mental health ever, and now for this to be a part of what can be the mainstream, and this being the norm, I really appreciate what y'all are doing. And thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Black Peer Perspective. We'll see you next time.